Okay, so last vlog I talked about how we had looked at a couple of plays and looked at DNA again, and I was starting to talk about how we looked at FOMO in terms of directing to get us into more of a directing style and understanding more about it. So, in terms of understanding good techniques and how directing works, we also looked more deeply into FOMO. FOMO as an introduction to a natural play that some people are going to do. Last year, one cast member did it, so we had some experience of what it was about. Basically, FOMO being a play about virtual reality and then reality. The whole idea is that the first half of the play is on virtual reality, and then the internet shuts off, everything on virtual reality is crashed, so everyone has to live in reality, and it's about the separation, the difference between those two, and how as a director you would physically show this through means of perhaps like the way the actors are showing it through like interaction with the audience, direct address, like breaking the fourth wall, or like dramatic techniques, and also through again, like with dramatic techniques, the styles, so like a Brecht style or a realistic style like Stanislavski, to show contrast between the two, and then also looking at the ideas of costume and set. I'm going to talk through quite a few of the ideas that we had during looking at that lesson. First off, we were given a task to look at set, how we would create the set if we were going to do FOMO, in terms of how we would visually construct it, but we were given a budget, and so we were put in pairs, and my partner and me and Hannah had to create the set from the budget of what we would find in a skip. But the interesting thing was not exactly what the budget was, even though that would depend because we're working in a school, obviously. So when we're actually putting on our directing piece, we have to have the budget so that it's a set. So it's more about if we had a bigger production, what we would do and enable ourselves to do, but how set can be utilised and how powerful it can be to translate across something. And especially with this play, the contrast between virtual reality and actual reality is something that must be so clear to an audience, but we had to figure out how to do it subtly because we had a smaller budget. When looking at our budget, we thought about things like that you would find, so you might find bricks, old TVs. The whole idea of contrasting between the two was about making the online reality, the virtual reality, a lot more idealistic, a lot more clean and pleasant than the actual reality, rather than the virtual. The virtual world is a lot more desirable, and it's like people putting on a mask to go into the virtual world. We had the idea of potentially like a door frame, if we couldn't find a door, but whatever you could find in Skip, to go between the two, could sync with potential sound effects, could be used the sound effects. Obviously we wouldn't have capabilities for lighting and things because of our budget, but if we had lighting, you could think about potential lighting and coming through a window in the actual reality, and then virtual reality you could have strange lights coming from behind mirrors. I think the main thing that I wanted to highlight, obviously I'm not going to talk through how we would have set it all up because that's not the important thing when it comes to it. The important thing is like knowing that the set is something that frames the whole piece, and that the way the audience, both the audience and the actors interact with it is what sets it apart from all other pieces and what helps promote the message. So in terms of that, my main important piece of the set was the idea of the mirrors. We thought about what kind of mirrors you find in a skip, and then we thought about mirrors being used as if someone is looking through to the mirror and then that is them posting a selfie, or that is them sending a message, and it's all about how you're just seeing the reflection of someone, you're just seeing what they want to perceive themselves as, how people perceive themselves, rather than the actual person on virtual reality. So it's all about like the deep metaphorical side. We thought about little handheld mirrors, and instead of when they're speaking out normally they could talk out, but then when they're going back into the virtual reality or sending a text, they can speak into the mirror, and the reflection is what you see, not their actual face, if it's a handheld, or if it's a bigger mirror for a group chat and a smaller text for a handheld mirror. And that shows how you're never really directly seeing the person, so you don't really know who that person is, and how messages can get spread so easily, like in FOMO, and messages are getting spread so easily, and it's really hard for it to sort of contain and control, because once it's out there, it's out there. So in terms of that, the idea of mirrors works really well. And then we thought, obviously, because of skip, there will be broken mirrors. So when the internet crashes, the idea of broken mirrors could symbolise that. And I think that will be really clear and obvious to an audience in terms of that as well. A lot of other groups did similar sort of things and used the idea of mirrors because they are a perception device, because they don't allow you to see the person clearly. It's just the reflection, and the whole metaphor of the reflection is really a good metaphor, we felt, in terms of showing like a social media and not an actual person. So developing upon that was what we did first. And we spent a long time discussing and contrasting. People had budgets of £5 and people had like West End budgets, and then people had unlimited amounts. But it all seemed to relate back to the idea of this mobile set that could transform from a virtual reality to a non-virtual one, as the play is split into two. So when looking at that, we want to think about, when we're directing, how changeable we want our sets to be and how accessible we need them to be, because the actors obviously need to interact with it. It needs to have value for it being there, also to create an atmosphere, but the importance of them, the characters interacting with it, adds emphasis on why we chose the set, rather than it just being a background framing device on its own. It needs to have more than that, and I think that's what we were discussing mainly as well in this lesson, because we were discussing the idea of the mirrors, discussing the idea of a potential broken telly and a door to go between the two. We also placed our audience in our one. We thought about, what do you find in a skip? You find loads of rubbish, and we could place the audience around sort of like an arch style, and have them sitting on like bits of rubbish, like old chairs and things like that, and it sort of symbolises how they are part of it. It's like bringing them into the idea of FOMO, fear of missing out. They can relate, and it's trying to make them relate to this main message that it's all about social media taking over. And when we take a step back from that, we understand that as humans as well, we're taken by social media and all its pressures. So by having them sit on the same things as we're going to have in our reality set, brings them to the sort of idea that they are also associating themselves. And I think it's important in terms of, if you had a wider concept, you could do things like that. I think in terms of our own plays, when we're directing, we might not have the abilities to do that, but if we have the capabilities to understand how they might view a set, then it might be easier to understand like what kind of message we're getting across. So if we have them so that they can visually see different aspects, so that the set intrigues them in different ways, then it can be at a point where it's really valuable to what message we're trying to show. So yeah, furthermore, after that, we looked at how we would put across like a text conversation. So that was more about like character interaction and how you would make it obvious that it's a text instead of a normal conversation in real life. Obviously the dialogue lends itself to sort of stuff like that, but how in terms of proxemics or facing the audience you would translate this. So that was another interesting aspect, but I think mainly we learned about the concept of set. Another really interesting piece of it that we looked at when evaluating each other's was the idea of using two separate casts, one for the online and one for the virtual, offline, to sort of show how people will present themselves in real life and on in the virtual world, and how sometimes like they can be similar and sometimes they can be total different representations. So the whole idea of using two casts was talked about a lot, in terms that you could have similar looking actors, if you had to your disposal, similar looking actors playing the virtual and one playing the realistic, showing how they are showing themselves to be as they are in real life, and then you can have other people like a catfish of a total different person. In frames of what this piece is about, you probably wouldn't need that so much, because everyone is who they are on in the virtual world. But in terms of like other plays, like I know when they studied the Nether, that would have been more useful. I think they actually did that themselves, so the whole idea of two casts would work really well in terms of that. But in this, it was just an interesting concept, and something that if we had more time and had a bigger cast to our disposal and talking about directing in general, could potentially explore.